G'day legends and happy Wednesday. I hope you're having a great midweek and you've crossed hump day. Now, firstly, I just want to say thank you. I know I don't show my appreciation for my audience enough on this channel. So again, just a massive thank you for being here. Whether you love me, you hate me, anything in between, that's fine. Thanks for being here. Now, we do have a fair bit to talk over, but one thing I will say is the war is in a bit of a lull at the moment. Now, we're coming off the back of elections in Russia, if you want to call it that. We've also had the incursion into Russia, which they've had to then move assets to try and counter that. And as well, Ukraine has a huge manpower and shell shortage, all things we've spoken about in length. Therefore, in the war we're not seeing any huge moves, but there's still a lot of bits and pieces behind the scenes we can speak about the politics. And also we do have a lot of footage to talk over today as well, because I know I don't show you guys enough to keep you maybe interested. So we do have a little bit to talk over. Now, there's a video going around which is no surprise to anyone that's handled weapon systems like this, but a lot of people saying it's misfired or the tank's armor or blah, blah, blah. I'll show you the footage and I'll talk about exactly what's happened here. Now, this is one of the Russian Legion troops that has crossed into Russia, firing at a Russian T-series tank with what, well, I call this a 66. I think Americans call it a law, but my experience with this, and I was called this, it's a 66 mil disposable anti-tank munition. That's the one you probably heard it in Call of Duty. You crack it, and as you crack it, little sights flip up, and then you can fire it. People have fired them rearwards as well, but we'll see exactly what happens here. So takes then cover down here. There's a slight skip in this, but cover behind this mount, aiming then the 66. This front foresight, you just got like 3 prongs, and that's just so you can track movement of a vehicle this close. It's not going to matter. And this is the one you clack down on top, and then we see this is a Russian tank. And basically nothing happens. It keeps moving onwards. Now, what is happening here? Why didn't this tank pop a lid? Well, these have an arming distance. Now, depending on the paper you're reading on these, will give a different arming distance. So I asked one of my mates in the army today, and he said 20 to 25 meters. Other people online are quoting 10 meters. Now, it's very difficult to judge the distance here, but not very far. And all that's happened here is the projectile out of this hasn't yet armed. Why do you have an arming? Well, in case he shoots this bloody thing, it won't blow him up. It is more common than anyone who's handled these will know. It's more common than people think to spud these in the ground in front of people. Silly, but not unheard of. Definitely not unheard of. So it's to protect the user, especially if you're firing somewhere like in a heavily treed area too, to not go into one of those. And from my eye, it's just not armed. It goes into the tracks. You can see it there. And that will have caused really no damage at all because it's unarmed. Now, unarmed at that point. Again, how do these arm? Well, it goes off it turning, and in that distance, why it's always a range of distance is all about how these are being handled, what conditions they're being kept in. That arming distance may change. That's why my mate said it could be 20, 25 meters on this. Now, why is so much smoke coming out of this tank? Well, there's a few explanations for this. Now, firstly, it could be damaged. Secondly, and I think more likely than that, is actually these tanks make a smoke screen. Now, you can see a lot of tanks with, smoke. They launch smoke out to create a smoke screen. As far as I'm aware, these older T-series tanks, what they actually do is they drip oil into the fuel. And then that, of course, if you ever had oily fuel, creates massive amount of smoke and can create a smoke screen like that. I'm pretty sure Navy ships can do the same thing, at least older ones. So yeah, just to clear up exactly, that's what happened in that footage. Now, I just want to look over another thing. Now, the person that then released this, he has, don't take this as 100% truthful, but I'm going to speak on this because I know instances like this 100% happen. Now, today in Kherson Oblast, a farmer stepped on a mine while grazing his cattle and he died on the spot. Also today in Kharkiv Oblast, a farmer hit a mine with his tractor. The tractor exploded and burned down, and the farmer is hospitalized. And then it follows with this photograph here of the tractor with implement on the back that has been burnt down. Now, when I was in the Kharkiv Oblast, a long time ago, 18 months minimum ago, this was happening. I was speaking to a farmer who had lost a lot of his cattle, as well as bits and pieces off his farm as well, to things like landmines and cluster bomblets as well. And this is going to be a huge problem in Ukraine moving forward. Even if the war ends tomorrow, there's going to be have to be something done about the amount of landmines and cluster bomblets and UXO, just unexploded ordnance, left behind in a battlefield like this. Now, these will survive in the ground 100 years. A professionally made mine, easily. It will last that long. And I've heard figures of up to 100 years it would actually take to demine properly some of these areas, and as well into the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to do it as well. There's no good way but very slowly clearing mines. Yes, those mine clearing vehicles with the chains, whatever you want to see, those are to clear mines in area for things like armoured vehicles to move through. To actually clear somewhere, to say this is clear of minefields, is a lot more slow and methodical than this. And this is why mines are just such a prick of a weapon, that it's area denial. It just denies the use of that area, and typically has a far bigger impact on the civilian population and the environment with your animals, everything, than it does actually against enemy soldiers. This is why we have landmine treaties, and why we're seeing them in some armies phased out or not used at all. But we're seeing clusters, landmines, the bomblets of clusters, they have a terrible rate of actually exploding. It can be 10 or 20% don't explode, and those bomblets are left on the ground as a landmine, if not more touchy than a landmine to actually go off. Like, they don't have a specific way that it has to go off, that it's just sitting there basically unable to be unarmed other than an explosion to set it off. Landmines are a terrible thing, and this is going to happen and have a huge effect on Ukraine's farming, agricultural sector after the war as well, and there's going to have to be huge funding put into clearing these areas as well. Now, with the landmines, Russia, of course, is not a signatory, or has not ratified, of course, because it's signed, then treaties against landmines. Ukraine has signed and ratified these landmine treaties, although both countries are using them extensively. You could say that Ukraine is going against its responsibilities in using these, and that is, to the letter of the law, 100% correct, although everything that I've read and spoken to a war lawyer about this is people are turning a blind eye due to the desperacy of the situation in the beginning of the war and the use of these. So I guess you can make up your mind about what you think about the use of landmines if you've signed and ratified and have the responsibility to not use them. But this is something we're going to see continue long after the war as well, and we're not sure it's going to happen because landmines are going in far faster than they're coming out, with defensive works being built everywhere. Now, we have a little bit more footage too here of Russia is trying to take back the Leopard 2A4 that had been abandoned by Ukrainian forces, and these two vehicles here that are skull dragging that tank then have been hit with munitions as well, and you can then see the troops off the first one and then second one here then abandoning their own vehicles, pulling it. We have a little bit better quality footage here, so you can see then the Leopard at the rear and these two pulling it here at the front. Now, I think this has copyright music, so I can't play the music over it. So we see it circling around here, very slow moving target, and we see multiple strikes on these here. So these are engineering style vehicles, then using two just to give it extra oomph to tow that Leopard. I wouldn't be surprised too, they don't show this in the footage, but I would not be surprised at all if then we saw instances of drones or artillery then targeting their own Leopard here to completely disable it more so it couldn't go back into the fight anyway, although it looks like it's had some very hard days sitting out there at the front. And then we see this drone then spud in. They're taking out those two front vehicles. I just thought that was something interesting to look over and speak about. Also, now, we need to talk about the Lend-Lease from yesterday, what was said, what and how a Lend-Lease may actually look, as I've had a bit of a thought about this since yesterday. So, of course, what we're speaking about is that Senator Lindsay has floated the prospect of a no-interest waivable loan with President Vladimir Zelensky, of course, because that US money as aid is stuck. But could he propose it as a no-interest waivable loan, and could this get it passed then the House? Now, when Speaker Mike Johnson, the Speaker, according to people familiar with the talks, told them to put the proposal together, test the waters with their GOP colleagues, and then if the conference approves, perhaps they'll pursue it. The hope is the loan will be a viable off-ramp for Hill Republicans. So sort of pleasing both sides. You're pleasing the Democrats for getting funding to Ukraine. You're pleasing the Republicans because it's then a loan, but you will be able to word it around how you would want to. The GOP, so the Republicans thinking on structuring a loan deal goes towards something like this. While President Joe Biden has asked for $60 billion for Ukraine, most of that money, $48 billion, would get pumped right back into America's defense industrial base. That leaves $12 billion going directly to Ukraine, taking that sum and making it low or no interest loan of some sort. And we've seen, this is nothing new. We've seen a lot of these before. And I think that this situation has a lot more potential than just this straight up military aid going in to actually get through the House past Speaker Johnson as well. And realistically, most often than not, these loans aren't actually paid back in monetary terms. And Senator Lindsay talked about that Ukraine has huge stores of oil and gas and minerals as well. And Ukraine will be a haven for investment after this war. So let's speak about lend leases gone past before. So equivalent to $773 billion in $22. But of course, this is back in the Second World War, were supplied to a number of countries, including the UK, the Soviet Union, France, China. Now, material was delivered and supplied at no cost to be used until returned or destroyed. In practice, most equipment was destroyed, although some of the equipment, such as ships, were returned. So here we have a quote from Senator Robert Taft saying, lending war equipment is a good deal like lending chewing gum. You certainly don't want the same gum back. In practice, very little was returned except for a few unarmed transport ships. Lend-lease agreements with 30 countries provided for repayment not in terms of money or returned goods, but in joint action directed towards the creation of a liberalised international economic order in a post-war world. That is, the US would be repaid when the recipient fought the common enemy and joined the world trade and diplomatic agencies such as the United Nations. And I think you can draw where this may happen for Ukraine as well, that it's not going to be repaid, but it's in the common interest of the US, because otherwise Ukraine would get into debt that it could maybe never repay. The GDP of Ukraine in the low hundreds of billions by the end of the war, if it was all lend-lease loans, would be very, very difficult to actually be able to repay that. Now, here we go. Lend-lease items retained were sold to Britain and 10% of their nominal value. And this is not something which we haven't seen before, that something is worth significantly less. This is exactly how Biden found more money in accounting for then the equipment to go back into Ukraine. Was, no, we're going to put the actual value of the item significantly less than when it was then bought at the beginning, how much it then cost, which is not unfair, but it is some tricky accounting. They freed up billions of dollars like that. The repayment of the interest-free loans required at the end of the war, under the War Act. In practice, the US did not expect to be repaid by the USSR after the war. The US received $2 million in reverse lend-lease from the USSR. This was mostly in the form of landing, servicing, and refueling of transport aircraft. Some industrial machinery and rare minerals were then sent to the US. Unknown shipments of rare minerals in the US Treasury as a form of cashless repayment of lend-lease. And I think that is most likely what we will see moving forward, and this money going through. We've said that one way or another, money is going to go to Ukraine, whether it's private investment, lend-lease, aid. We're not sure. We've always said money will most likely go there, but we just don't know how much and how it will look. But Ukraine will be a haven for investment if successful after this war. The Ukrainian military will have to be completely rebuilt, refitted. Civilian roads and buildings will all have to be rebuilt, and those in the construction business or in the private military business will absolutely be licking their lips to get part of this. And if you don't think that high-ranking military members or politicians have their fingers in these private pies after the war, you are incredibly wrong. So Let's have a look at the maps, as this shouldn't take too long. So, of course, we have Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, and the purple since 2014. Now, on the MOD map, the only change that we do see is down here in Avdiivka, in Orlivka. So today's the 20th. We roll back to then the 19th. We're just looking here. We then see this pop up here. And by this map, it is looking like all of Orlivka has come under occupation by the Russian forces. There's no other changes on this map, although we have seen in the last couple of days Russia advancing in Robotny as well. But today it looks like, according to this map at least, it has then stopped. Now, this map shows exactly what Syriac is showing here. Situation west of Avdiivka, Russian army took full control over the locality of Orlivka. Now, we have a little bit more to speak about from Syriac as well. So in this, we're talking about Krasnohorivka. So this is Avdiivka here, and then we have Nevelsky and then Krasnohorivka. These are all very hot fronts at the moment. Now, here we have this movement just here. What if we look? Let's try and line this up. So these areas just in here, showing that Russians has moved back here. Now, recent video footage shows Russian attack towards Ukrainian positions and a tank close to the trench system. We'll show you the footage. Now, during the last week, Russian army retreated from the southern streets following the failure to consolidate positions there. So far, Russian forces still located in the first houses of Shemchevka Street. So there's still guys apparently down in here, but we have seen new footage of a Ukrainian tank operating in this area. Now, we will show you this footage here, but the tank then has fired, and then the tank then is subsequently actually taken out. And then we do see, that shows more of the tank. I'll put that on the Telegram. And then we do see then FABs, this is the tank here, and then FAB 500s, I believe, dropped from aircraft then onto Krasnohorivka, and this is one of the areas that Russia is dropping a hell of a lot of those FABs. Now, talking about missiles and whatever, Ukrainian pages are reporting today that a Su-24M has been taken down over the Black Sea, apparently going to fire missiles into Odessa. That said, yet we haven't seen any footage of this or anything of radars, and fighter bomber hasn't yet said that that has happened or not. So maybe just wait out on that. We know what it's like with some fighter aircraft. Now, from Syriac as well, I just want to speak on this. Lately, threats of an open confrontation with Russia have begun to flourish among European leaders, who warn that it would be necessary to prepare for war. I wouldn't say this is lately. This has been the last, say, 6 months. We've seen more and more of this, that if we don't arm Ukraine, if Ukraine don't win, there will be a war between the West, NATO, and Russia directly, and there's been talk of build-up, conscripts, everything. Honestly, the time for such a scenario is a long way off. Russia has no intention of advancing in a field other than the Ukrainian one. The entry of Finland and Sweden, this is into NATO, has stopped any attempt to expand its influence in this region, leaving only Belarus as an ally. Without nuclear use, which everyone knows that is just, it would just go to shit quickly, NATO would flatten Russia if they tried to do that in entering in Finland or Poland. That's just how it would happen. Especially Russia's been really had a struggle in Ukraine, and by the time they were to get anywhere near that, they're not going to have anywhere near the power at least they begun the war with. Potentially, we have spoken that Russia may come out of this more powerful than it entered the war. But anyway, right here and now we're speaking. A war against Russia would be highly unpopular and highly costly, considering the economic problems and productive shortcomings of the European states to carry out considerable rearmament, conscription tasks, and war economy. This history would be incredibly unpopular, and of course, we are struggling to rearm with basic things like shells. I've said this, that we are incredibly lucky, if you want to use that for want of a better term, lucky that we've discovered our productivity of shells was so far under what it should be for a war, in a war that doesn't directly involve us, if you can say that. That if we stepped into a wider war with more than 2 countries involved, we would have been out of shells in a bloody week. On the other hand, there is the nuclear threat. This option is not contemplated either. Nuclear weapons will continue to be the deterrent weapon that will prevent a global conflict. Incredibly true. Nuclear weapons have saved far more lives than they have ever taken. Despite all this, it is inevitable to think about the possibility of a war in the future. The decision is in the hands of political leaders and not of individuals. In case they want to convince people, the excuse of defence of democracy and European values will not be enough. Avoiding a major conflict should be the goal of all leaders. Hence, diplomacy should be the main procedure to achieve peace in conflicts. However, and frankly, diplomacy is far from being the protagonist in the Ukrainian conflict. So, saying here that does anyone, including the people of the war, have then the appetite for a wider war? Now, something which has got a lot of traction in Australia, and it may not be relevant to you, but I think it's relevant to this as a whole. And I haven't watched the documentary yet, but I will watch tonight and I will get back to you on it. But the ABC, which is Australia's federally funded, so taxpayer funded broadcaster, has put a documentary on there that people are not happy about, especially the Ukrainian ambassador, or the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia. Now, my take on this is similar to the Tucker Carlson interview. Just because you're not happy with it doesn't mean that people shouldn't be able to then watch it. So basically what it is the documentary is a journalist embedded with Russian forces in the beginning of the war, and it's trying to tell the story from the other side. Now, the ambassador has come out with this. The program aired last night on Four Corners. Ukraine's War, The Other Side was the journalistic equivalent of a bowl of vomit. It unquestionably repeated and aired countless blatant lies, historical distortions, racist claims, and propaganda narratives emanating from the Kremlin. Inasmuch, it completely served the interests of Russia's dictator Putin. Also minimised and denigrated the deaths of thousands of innocent Ukrainian men, women and children who have been killed by Russian soldiers in an illegal and brutal invasion strongly condemned by Australia and the majority of countries through the UNGA resolution in March 22. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation should be ashamed that it put total garbage to air. Through the Minister for Communications, I will ask for a meeting with the Managing Director of the ABC and the Executive Producer of Four Corners to understand what process led to the airing of this pro-Putin and pro-violence propaganda piece by Australia's national broadcaster. I will share with them the facts that the program totally disregarded. Now, the ABC hasn't released a full statement yet, but has said this. So, they've said the documentary is still available, is considered an important contribution to the reporting of war, saying Ukraine's War, The Other Side is a challenging but legitimate documentary made by a reputable journalist, Sean Langan, and first aired last month on the UK's ITV that offers a rare insight into the lives of Russian soldiers during the war. Now, I haven't watched it yet, but from the little shorts I've seen, it looks like it's interviewing guys in the war, talking about it. Not sure yet. And this is something that I want to touch on. If you're interviewing someone in a documentary like this and they are saying these narratives, that's very different from then the journalists themselves then saying the narratives. It is an interview. Anyway, it has copped a lot of blowback as well. Let's have a look at this. So this bloke who is an Aussie has said, blood is boiling right now. Just pause and imagine a Western reporter during World War II talking to SS soldiers in occupied territory, trying to make them seem like victims after several years of them being absolute sadists to the people they had subjugated. Again, I haven't watched this yet, so I can't comment on exactly what has been said or what the documentary tries to show. But a documentary at the end of the day can show things that which you may not be comfortable with. There are documentaries about serial killers where they interview the serial killer justifying what he did. Does that then mean the documentarian or Netflix, whoever the gen choose to put it on, sides with them? No. But with this, I sort of shared, like I said, the same opinion like with the Tucker Putin interview. But in a world with open and free media, so much different to wars gone past, you're going to see more of this that then challenges you. I guarantee if we had something like the SS, Nazi Germany, now there would be journalists speak to leaders there and soldiers there. It would happen. Now, again, I have said about, I think, comparing what Hitler did, what Stalin did to what Russia has done, not to take away from what Putin has done, but to try and compare the two, I think is a ridiculous comparison, even on just numbers alone. And I myself, I am probably, in these people's eyes, very guilty of this. I've spoken to tens and tens of people fighting for Ukraine. I've spoken to multiple people who have fought as well for the Russian side, whether Russian or part of Wagner PMC. One of my long-term goals in doing this, however long I do this for, is to also speak with the Taliban. Now, I think in conflict, in media, there's nothing more dangerous than creating an echo chamber. It will let false narratives run wild. And the great thing with social media that we have now is it's easier than ever just to rebut whatever claims are being made, especially like this documentary, say, to a broader audience than documentary will actually be then shown to. So, you can release this and you can say whatever you want about it. In years gone past where you just had a physical paper or just TV, it could spread like wildfire, and how could you actually have a say against it? Well, you're writing a bloody letter to the editor. You're going to have more controversial stuff, and you can't just have things that you like and things that you want to see and agree with either. You will be offended by things online. You will be offended by parts of media. And the best quote that I've ever heard about freedom of speech and freedom of media is, when you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world you fear what he might say. So I will watch it. I'll get back to you and I'll take some notes and tell you what I have thought of this. Now, a few little bits and pieces here as well. We have some footage of Kozinka that has been shelled. Now, let's have a look at where then Kozinka is here. So on the maps, of course, we have then, this is Belgorod, this is Kursk, Kharkiv, and Sumy. And then we have Kozinka down in here. So this is, of course, Nikolatovo, where we have seen the Russian legions, the Ukrainian-backed soldiers, cross then into these areas. And we have footage from Russians here driving around saying that it is fucked. And you can see that everything here has been shelled and there's a hell of a lot of damage here. Of course, civilians have been moved out of these areas behind then the defensive works that are there, and a shell lands very, very close to them there as well. So there's a lot of arms coming back across. Now, Putin, in a speech only today or yesterday, has then said this: I'd like to note at this point that at one time the West actively used various cross-border radical and terrorist groups and in part encouraged their aggression against Russia. That Kiev has also switched to terrorist tactics with similar external support and often under direct instructions. This includes the shelling of peaceful cities, assaults on government officials and public figures, and attempts to recruit perpetrators of subversive and terrorist attacks targeting critical infrastructure and public spaces in Russia. Now, this is all part of asymmetrical warfare and the use of then these, we're not fighting for Ukraine. We're not Ukrainians. We are Russians fighting in Russia. Narrative around how these units operate as well outside of certain limits put. So that is then what Putin has said. Now, we have seen a Shahed drone being taken down by electronic warfare here as well, with Ukrainians here inspecting it. We can see more of these are coming in black. These are a very interesting piece. Now, I need to talk about shells going into Ukraine. Shells shortage is a critical element so far of this war that is front and center of everything. As we know, that the Czechs, through their Prime Minister Denis Shamal, has been looking externally for shells. Now, firstly, I want to say no one's actually said where these are coming from yet. We've speculated about maybe where, or maybe the country doesn't want to be publicly said, but it's not known where they're coming from. There are alliances built to then fund these shells in, to buy them. Now, what I have said that it likely could be for the 155s is it may actually be into the UAE and Saudi buying them back, as we've heard that speculated before, buying back shells that they bought, which those countries have a huge influx of military hardware over the past years. Anyway, Prague has located 800,000 artillery rounds in third countries earlier this year to supply to Ukraine, raising funds for the first batch of 300,000. Some people today are saying they found another 700,000, but I can't find that confirmed. That Czech said the deliveries are expected by June at the latest, so it's still a little bit to come. Anyway, we hope the Czech initiative, which Luxembourg joined, will help us, and beginning from April, so very soon, we will have enough ammunition to deter our front line. We also count on supplying long-range and middle-range missiles to cut Russian logistics on the occupied territories. It is also crucially important as the artillery shells for us. Of course, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has said the Allies were not doing enough to help Kyiv, especially with the US Congress bill that we spoke about right in the beginning. So that has caused then huge shell shortages, along with a lot of other stuff. You can't just blame one factor when you've got a lot of factors that all contribute to shell shortages. Lastly, the MOD update about Black Sea drones from the UK. Now, Ukraine's continued success in conducting its asymmetric maritime strike campaign has resulted in a visit from Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to the Black Sea Fleet Command Post in Crimea. Shoigu received updates on Ukrainian operations and discussed the performance of the Russian naval assets in the region. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, he announced new measures for Black Sea Fleet units to mitigate the threat of uncrewed aerial vehicles and uncrewed surface, so drones in the air and in the sea. Of how do we actually mitigate this? And we've spoken before, and Fighter has suggested these ships need to go somewhere. Unfuck how you actually do this. Like, have drones go at them like, inert ones, and learn how to actually counter this. Emphasis was given to the conducting of daily anti-UAV USV preparedness exercises to enable ships' crews to quickly repel attacks during the day and at night. Shoigu also ordered additional large caliber weapons to be fitted to unspecified assets to augment their defenses. The defenses for this on ships all around the world are firepower. As far as not massive cannons, it's machine guns on the deck. The Russian Navy has highly likely resorted to limiting its operations in the eastern Black Sea as its losses mount and its threat perceptions increase, with Ukraine continuing to seek out opportunities to strike at distance. The Russian Ministry of Defense has been prompted to increase its efforts to preserve its fleet in the Black Sea. Of course, this comes after we've seen a couple of ships sunk in the last few weeks. But this is going to be a threat to all navies around the world as countries or groups around the world continue to develop these highly mobile, very deadly drone boats at a very reasonable cost. Legends, this video for some reason was impossible just to get through. I couldn't speak a word. Anyway, hope you're doing well. I'll speak to you soon.